Nick Saban announced yesterday afternoon that he was retiring as the head coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide. And I understand that he's 72 years old. I get it. Age, I'm sure, certainly played a factor here in this decision. But I just cannot wrap my mind around the idea that college football will go on and somebody else will be standing on the sidelines as the head coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide in 2024. I mean, at this point, you've got Bear Bryant and you've got Nick Saban that are synonymous with Alabama football. And I know Bear Bryant was one of the all-time greats in his run that ended in 1982 with the Tide. But Alabama football is Nick Saban. And I know Nick Saban won a national title at LSU. I know he coached at Michigan State. I know he worked for the Miami Dolphins. But Nick Saban is Alabama football. And I have had a night to sleep on it, to just sort of mentally process what this news means for Alabama, for the greater college football landscape. You know, who's going to replace Nick Saban? That's immediately where my mind went to once I saw the news. But I think before we sort of stew on what this could mean for the future of college football, we just need to take a minute to recognize what Nick Saban did, one, for the sport, but two, for the program, for Alabama. At this point in time, I know we wonder every year, like, what's the best job in college football? And a lot of times that's tied now in the NIL era and the portal era. It's tied to booster money. It's tied to what can the university do for the program. But Nick Saban built this program into, I think, the premier job in college football. I just never thought that somebody else would fill it. I mean, you're looking at the whole. You're looking at success. You're looking at the ability to pay up to compete. You're looking at, Texas, Oregon, Georgia, Alabama. Texas A&M likes to think that they're in there because they got the money. Maybe they haven't had the success, but Alabama, I think, is the premier job. Ohio State's in there as well. It's the premier job in college football, and it is that way because Nick Saban has been their coach for the last 17 years. His achievements are ridiculous. They belong on a tablet somewhere on top of a mountain. I mean, these are completely unobtainable in modern college football. And I know he did all of this in modern college football, but you just can't see a scenario where this sort of success is replicated. Here's what I'm talking about. He's got more first-round picks than losses in his 17 seasons at Alabama. I want to say he had 27 losses and 44 first-round draft picks. Just let that one marinate for a second. More first-round picks than losses in 17 seasons. He's had 10 of the last 13 number one overall recruiting classes. That's insane. He's had 8 SEC championships in 17 seasons. They just hoisted the trophy once again this past year in 2023, knocking off Georgia. Guess how many the rest of the SEC has combined? 8. Alabama has as many SEC titles as the entire rest of the conference combined under Nick Saban. This is the craziest one, though. It's very difficult to win national championships, and Nick Saban has won 7 altogether, 6 as Alabama's head coach. This blows my mind. Every single player who played for 4 years, who played all 4 years of their eligibility under Nick Saban, was recruited by Nick Saban, played all 4 years. Every single one of those players won a national championship at Alabama. That's ridiculous. I mean, we're talking about records like, LeBron's scoring record in the NBA. It's just an unfathomably ridiculous record, and it just keeps tallying up. Something like that, where a player or a coach over a 17-year period, every single one of their players who exhausted all their years of eligibility under that coach, won a national championship. Absolutely mind-boggling. It is shocking that he is no longer going to be the coach. And I think a lot of people speculated that it was possible, if only because he's 72 years old. And I know once you get to be a certain age, there's just going to be questions every offseason. Could this be the year? Yada, yada, so on and so forth. And with Nick, it happened to be this year, and it happened to be a surprise, something that I don't think anybody really saw coming. And it seemed very sudden too. He's been doing a weekly stint on the Pat McAfee show, I think all through the college football season. And Pat McAfee asked him on his last segment after the Rose Bowl, after they lost to Michigan, are you considering retiring? I know a lot of people are saying that potentially you've thought about it. And the way he said it was so offhand too. I mean, it was a casual question. It was not I think this is what's happening and I'm trying to get the answer. It was, I feel like I have to ask you this, so I'm just doing it, because I have to do my job. But the way McAfee asked the question, it was like, okay, nobody really thinks this is true, but we're speculating. We're at the point in the offseason where speculation runs rampant. Here's what Saban had to say to McAfee when he was asked if there was a chance he could retire at the end of the season.
Why do you think it gets brought up every single year as if you were going to be done?
Well, because I'm getting old, I guess.
You look good, though, Coach. You look good.
Look, I ask everybody that asks me that question, are you going to be here for 4 years? Some player that asks me, when you're going to retire, I might look at them and say, well, can you guarantee me that you're going to be here for 4 years? And they look at me like, hell no, I'm not making that.
Doesn't exactly sound like a guy who's going to retire in a matter of days, does it? I know now that it's happened, now that the announcement has been made, we're trying to figure out the reason for why he left and what it is that caused him to do it. Obviously, when he was asked about retiring, his mind went to NIL. It went to pay for play. Just the way the NCAA is nowadays with college football, he is right. College football is a pay-for-play system. And even though Nick Saban has been at the top of the mountain for the past decade and a half, he has still experienced the toll of NIL and what it has done, the transfer portal, what it has done to modern college football. And I'm sure that there are many different factors involved in Saban's decision to retire. But NIL certainly seems like one of the foremost things on his mind when he considers, do I, quote unquote, hang it up? Am I done? That seemed to be what he was considering a few days prior to making this announcement. Now, the other part of this, who takes over for the greatest college football coach in the history? Who takes over? Who can take over? Like I said, this is the premier job in college football. And I think there are a few names that jump out immediately. There's obviously so many connections. Nick Saban's coaching tree is massive. There's no heir apparent in the building for Alabama. And there's a lot of extremely accomplished coaches that are going to get a phone call from the Alabama athletic department asking about this job. I think there's a few names that should be considered right off the rip. Dan Lanning is reportedly the leader in the clubhouse, as it were, for the job. He's 37 years old. He has gotten Oregon to a potential college football contender. Oregon was really, really good this past year. They combined several of the elements that make a dominant college football team. They were extremely physical on both sides of the offensive and defensive line, and they also spread you out and threw the ball all over you. They were a team that definitely, if you didn't have the dudes to match them on the line of scrimmage, you were getting killed. But if you did have the dudes to match them on the line of scrimmage, they could still go put up gobs of points. And I know Washington beat them twice, but frankly, Oregon didn't have any setbacks at all against any other team they played on their schedule. And Washington ended up in the national championship, so they were no slouch either. Speaking of Washington, Kalen DeBoer, dude has won everywhere, absolutely everywhere. He just took Washington to the national championship behind the arm of Michael Penix and all those ridiculous receivers. The other part that I think gets glossed over is the fact that offensive line for Washington won the Joe Moore Award for the best offensive line in college football. He built them up. Now, they were, I think, 61st in scoring defense, so they weren't quite up to snuff in terms of being able to stop opposing teams on the defensive line of scrimmage in the secondary, but he created a ridiculous offense, a high-flying offense that scored a bunch of points, threw for a ton of yards, and ultimately took them to the national championship game. Beat Oregon twice, by the way, which is no small feat. So Kalen DeBoer absolutely should be considered, and I think he will be. The question mark with Kalen DeBoer is he's never coached in the Southeast, in that Alabama, Auburn, LSU footprint. He comes from Fresno State. He was a coordinator at Indiana and ended up at Washington. But, I was thinking about it too, like Urban Meyer came to mind as sort of the footprint argument was, and Brian Kelly too, now that we're thinking about it. I mean, Brian Kelly coached at Notre Dame for years and years and years and goes down to LSU and, hasn't quite gotten it, but 2 years in, I mean, things are moving the right direction. Malik Neighbors is about to be a top 10 pick, and Jaden Daniels won the Heisman Trophy. So Brian Kelly is working his magic down there in Baton Rouge. But also Urban Meyer coached at Utah, went down to Florida, was successful in the SEC, and then went up to Ohio State and was dominant in the Big Ten. So I think this footprint argument, it is a recruiting argument, but I don't know how much stock I really would put in that argument. I think if you can coach, you can coach. And Kalen DeBoer has proved, in my mind, to be a dude, one of those coaches that can elevate your program, or in this case, maintain what Nick Saban has built. Other names here: Steve Sarkisian was a coordinator under Saban for a long time. And I think, too, Sarkisian was going to be the heir apparent in-house if there was going to be one. I guess the problem with that is that it's Alabama and your coordinators get poached every single year because you're always a top 5 team in the landscape of college football. You're always in the playoff and you're always in the mix to win a national championship. So Texas came calling, and I'm sure there was a conversation behind closed doors where Sarkisian went to Saban and said, you know what? I just got offered Texas. And Saban looked at him and was like, yeah, you can't turn down the Texas job. That is one of the best jobs in the country. It was a down program that needed somebody to resurrect it and take it to new heights, and Sarkisian did that, had them in the playoff this past year. It looks like they finally got over the hump with Sarkisian at the helm. Certainly he will get a phone call. The other name here that I think is really interesting, and I don't know if he would consider the Alabama job. Certainly, I feel like there will be a phone call at the bare minimum. Dabo Swinney will probably get a call from Alabama to see gauge interest, perhaps in his interest in the Alabama opening. Swinney's interesting because he took Clemson. They were Clemsoning for a very long time, and Swinney took them to the college football playoff, took them to new heights, won 2 national championships. Outside of Nick Saban in the modern college football era, Swinney's probably the most accomplished coach out there. And I think his resume will probably get a long look from the brass at Alabama. And he's got the ties to Alabama. He was a grad assistant. He played there. Will Swinney get the job ultimately? I don't know. And I don't even know if he would be the top pick. I think if I had to call my shot, as it were, on who the coach would be, I would lean Dan Lanning. He's the younger guy. He's the guy who has shown that, he's got the defensive background, and he got the defense right at Oregon, but also the offense is good. And he's recruited extremely well in his time at Oregon. So Lanning feels like the leader in the clubhouse. Kalen DeBoer should get a long look as well. Steve Sarkisian, probably going to get a phone call. Dabo Swinney, kind of on the outside looking in there, could potentially be an option. But the last couple of years, Clemson has fallen off, and Sweeney hasn't utilized the portal and NIL the way that top programs probably should. That might come at his detriment in Alabama's search for their next coach. It's an absolute wild time to be alive. Nick Saban no longer being the coach at Bama it's wild. And I still don't think I've fully processed what that means. But, the main takeaways, the things that I have landed on are Bama's fine. The program is built up to a point where they're going to have their pick of the litter in terms of coaches. It's the premier job. I don't think any coach would look at that offer and be able to say no, frankly. But at the same time, it's going to be really difficult to follow the GOAT and to be compared to a guy who is incomparable. Alabama is in a very interesting spot, and I think at the least we should take a moment to just recognize what Nick Saban has done for the sport of college football, what he's done for the Alabama program. Today is a day for recognizing Nick Saban's contribution to the sport of college football.